and welcoming everyone to tonight's Core Volunteer Training lesson. I'm your host, Brett Cease, and Core Volunteer Training is specifically created to support you in becoming more active and empowering you in achieving your larger goals for climate advocacy. So by way of a quick introduction for both of our presenters tonight, I'll just feature a quick description of who both Stephanie and Jim are. Stephanie Doyle works as the National Outreach and Partnership Coordinator for CCL, formulating and strengthening relationships with other non-governmental organizations in the energy and climate field, and has currently just finished her Master's of Science in Energy Policy at Johns Hopkins. Congratulations. And Jim has been volunteering for CCL for many years and now serves as lead for CCL's outreach to conservatives and is responsible for growing our conservative volunteer base, helping volunteers work with conservative audiences and guiding the activity of CCL's Conservative Caucus. We're so grateful to have both of you on the line tonight, and I'll pass it first over to Jim in just one moment after reviewing our learning goals for tonight. So they're threefold. We're hoping after tonight's lesson, all attendees should be able to have the following achievements: understanding the foundational difference that values that guide both conservatives and progressives, really feeling more comfortable in engaging both sides of the aisle in deeper respect-based listening to understand their perspective on this topic, and also to demonstrate how to have productive conversations with people from different perspectives than yourself using these tools for tonight's lesson. So without further ado, the agenda, the roadmap that we have laid out before us is pretty straightforward. Jim's going to start with overview of more foundations theory and then talking more specifically about how to apply that to the conservative view. We'll have time for Q&A then on the conservative side, and then Stephanie will take over and ground us on understanding the progressive view and having productive conversations. And then we'll actually have an exercise where you can pick where you want to go into a breakout room, whether with another fellow CCL supporter, and practice a progressive-oriented conversation or a conservative one, and then we'll regroup and discuss at the end. So with that, I'll pass it to you, Jim, and we're very grateful again for everyone being on the line. Thank you.
So I'm going to talk about specifically about connecting with conservatives. I just want to take a minute and say that we're going to talk about speaking to them differently, conservatives and progressives in a general sense. And this, sometimes people can think that feels manipulative, and I like to really not view it as manipulative at all, but really just speaking to somebody in a way they can hear you, just like you speak to your spouse differently than you speak to your neighbor, you speak to your kids differently than you speak to your parents. There's nothing wrong with speaking to someone in a way that's appropriate for the conversation you're having. One of the authors that we rely on heavily in CCL for structuring how we train people on this is Jonathan Haidt, who studied how people decide what's appropriate when they're looking at actions they're going to take, their morals. And Jonathan Haidt's come up with 5 moral foundations, or 5 values that we often consider in figuring out whether something's appropriate for us to do, that are listed on the left side of your screen. Does it harm somebody? Is it fair? Looking at in-group loyalty, we're often loyal to groups, looking at authority, and looking at purity and things we consider pure and sacred. One of the advantages of Jonathan Haidt's work is that he's also pulled apart how people self-identify politically. And what he found is that people who view themselves more liberal often tend to value those first 2 more. Does it harm somebody, and is it fair? And people that are more conservative often bring in the other suite of 3 other profiles for evaluating whether something's acceptable behavior. Looking at the loyalty of their group, looking at authority, and looking at a dimension of purity and sanctity. And in speaking with people that are progressive in particular on how to message conservatives, I find it's often good to get people to understand these dimensions just a little bit more. So I want to walk through each of just these last 3. We have more training on this that extends into a longer conversation. In-group loyalty, we all value certain groups differently. We value our family differently than we value people in our neighborhood. We value people in our neighborhood differently than we value people in our state. And this is common throughout history and throughout all cultures. And it's important to understand that some people consider those groups in a much stronger sense than other people. And oftentimes people that some people think they really don't value in-group loyalty, and will even think that some statements about valuing people in your group can sound exclusive or inappropriate. And as a thought experiment you can do on the side is just consider your own group and consider how you feel if somebody, the groups that you consider yourself strongly part of, and how you connect with those people. The reason I bring it up is because conservatives value in-group loyalty. They look to people in their group, and they are very subconsciously aware of the groups that they're in. And oftentimes, the two pictures on the left, oftentimes we communicate what groups we're in loudly without saying anything. So if we walk into a slide presentation at a Rotary Club, and our slide deck has examples that have the Climate Reality Project on the bottom, that's the source of our slides, we're saying something about in-group loyalty. Similarly, if you walk into your CCL meeting with your Make American Great hat, you're saying something about in-group loyalty, and somebody might say something to you. Or if you walked into a Sierra Club meeting with your MAGA hat on, you might not want to wear your Make American Great hat to the Sierra Club. We all have these groups, and we all communicate about them subconsciously and accidentally.
Check to see when Dan will be back.
So somebody,
I'll mute,
yeah, I can't see who that is, Brett.
Yeah, no problem.
The other way that we can bring in group loyalty when we're speaking on climate is to speak local impacts. Oftentimes slide programs that I've seen will talk about flooding and impacts in Bangladesh. And if you can just find those local impacts when you're speaking to a conservative, speaking about people in your neighborhood, speaking about how people are affected in your church community, how people are affected in your city, connecting to those local impacts is much more relevant to somebody that values in-group loyalty than trying to connect the reason for action to a group that is well outside of a group of people you actually know and consider yourself part of. The authority versus subversion, there are a number of sources that we can also cite that to a conservative sound like people trying to overthrow the capitalist system. This is a quote from Naomi Klein, and I'm not going to, you can read it yourself, but using material that verges on the idea that we just need to overthrow the whole system here starts to rub people the wrong way, versus bringing in quotes from people that match people's view of authority. So just using quotes in your conversation and examples from people in the Department of Defense, from people within the Republican Party, showing respect for that authority, but also paying some tribute to people that you think are authorities that the other person would also agree with. I'm running through these fairly quickly, and then we can talk about them some, but purity and sanctity is one that is often complicated in that each person views different things as pure and sacred, and some people really try to hold back from viewing things as pure and sacred. And if you're confused about the concern of some people about people kneeling during the national anthem, versus some people kind of using the concern about people taking the moment of the national anthem playing as when they wanted to protest, as opposed to any other time when they had the camera's view, you could start looking at that as an example of a moment where somebody used something that a group considered pure and sacred to make a different point. So the flag is often as another symbol that conservatives often view pure and sacred. And the next slide, I want to just show an example of how the flag is sometimes used at marches. These are both examples of, I don't know where these were, but it might have been a climate march or where people used the flag in a way that was trying to make a creative statement. That both of these could be viewed as kind of clever, but they're both using the flag, changing it a little bit and giving it a different meaning that has a negative connotation of America's about to blow up the world, or America's states we're now just a confederacy of businesses and no longer a union of states, by replacing the stars with logos. So the next slide shows maybe a little different example of saying, how could you use the flag, use things that are pure and sacred to connect with people that consider it pure and sacred? And the way you do that is just to respect things that other people consider pure and sacred. It's really as simple as that. If you can think of things that people consider pure and sacred, don't degrade them, and don't use them as for a secondary point. Use them for in the way that somebody that considers it pure and sacred would want it used. Show respect to the person by showing respect to the things they consider pure and sacred. So I'm going to wrap it up there with the next slide that just has a bunch of suggested references. Jonathan Haidt has some great material out there. Each of these in the slides are going to be hot linked. You can go in there and click on any of those and see him speak to a wide range of interviewers, from Nick Gillespie, who's very libertarian, Bill Moyers, I wonder if I need to remove that now, Cato Institute, very conservative, over to a TED Talk, more liberal, On Being with Krista Tippett, about as far over to the left as you're going to get in terms of just a progressive interviewer. He's spoken in front of a number of different audiences and has a very similar messaging where he's saying the same thing of speaking to people with respect for the values that those people have, and building your conversations on that respect. And then we'll return to this at the end of the conversation as we do an exercise also.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Jim. And all of the references are available in the slides that we just put in. So if you just go to cclusa.org, and then from there, if you just type in /aisle communications, that's the short code for tonight's slides, cclusa.org /aisle communications. If it's helpful too, Jim, I've just put a link to the Conservative Caucus's conservative quotes spreadsheet that just go through a whole bunch of last names and important endorsers from the conservative community. If that's all right with you, Jim, what I'll do is pass the baton to Stephanie. And again, thank you so much for being on the line tonight, and we're looking forward to jumping into that exercise in a little bit.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for being on. I'm Stephanie. I work here in our DC office. I do a lot of our partnership work with other organizations, and the majority of that is with other environmental groups, but also a bit of business groups, national security, kind of whatever our volunteers, like you guys, work up the flagpole from a policy front. So most of what I'm going to talk about is you can use when you're talking to somebody you know who's progressive or identifies as liberal, but this also applies to any outreach you may be doing to other organizations or people who are members of another organization. And before I jump in, I just wanted to go over some considerations that I think are really important and help frame the discussion when you have these conversations with people who identify as progressive or liberal. And so the first one is to really remember that in the same way that we approach members of Congress with the relationship in mind, you really want to do the same thing when you're talking to somebody about climate, especially someone from another environmental group. Relationships matter. You really want to think of this as opening a door to talking about climate solutions rather than winning a debate with somebody, whether cap and trade is better than a carbon tax, which is better than regulation. I think it's important to remember that we're going to need a whole lot of solutions, and that you need to develop a relationship and build up trust with both sides of the aisle for us to really move the conversation forward where everybody feels heard. So one of the things that you can do is really focus on a shared vision of the future. I think most progressives and liberals know where we want to get, which is a carbon-free future, no more fossil fuels, this big green economy transition, but we often disagree on how to get there, and whether different technologies are acceptable. And it's just important to remember that if you can connect on the value of where we're going, it will make your conversations a lot more productive than sometimes arguing over how we get there. And part of that is to remember not to assume that carbon fee and dividend is the best or the only solution. So I've heard this explained as the silver buckshot. I don't know if others have heard that, but basically saying that for climate, there's no real silver bullet. There's silver buckshot, which means, you know, a bunch of different solutions. And the way I like to think of carbon fee and dividend is if you were on a boat and the boat's sinking because there's a hole, plugging the hole is part of the problem, but you're still gonna have to get all this water off the sides. And so I like to think of carbon fee and dividend as the best first step, the best way to plug the hole while we're still addressing a lot of these other issues of adaptation and transitioning fossil fuel workers and all of these other topics that come up when you speak with progressives and liberals. And it's also important to remember that to go into these conversations with some humility, especially when you're talking to other environmental groups, ones that have been around for a long time. There's people who've been working on climate for a very long time, as I'm sure many of you have. And just important to remember that being humble about why CCL argues for this position that we do, part of it comes from the fact that we work in a bipartisan way, which not all groups do. And that authenticity and demonstrating that we really are committed to a long-term effort to achieve climate solutions, that goes a long way. And then we also have an action team that specifically works to address the concerns and messaging and working with environmental justice groups who have more specific concerns when it comes to carbon pricing and climate solutions in general. And one of the things that's come out of that action team is to remember that the conversations you have should really be a mindset rather than thinking about going in there to message something, and to really try to, you always want to be interested in someone else and not just to be interesting with your opinions, but to really understand what brings this person to the climate fight and why, what values they value basically when they're looking at climate and climate solutions, because it can change the priorities that you see when it comes to those. So all that being said, there are some tools when you do have these conversations, especially, and like I said, this can be with your neighbor, your family, or with somebody that works for another organization. And so one of them, these are when you're talking about carbon fee and dividend. One of those is to use the phrase all households instead of American households. When you think about a lot of the values that progressives and liberals have, this idea that you can link it to fairness and equality, which is what Jim had mentioned that Jonathan Haidt has looked at, and saying all households sounds a bit more fair to somebody who's coming from a progressive point of view than American households. Additionally, when you say market-based or market-friendly, sometimes on the progressive left, they look at markets as having failed, and that markets aren't working. So using the phrase corrective to the market rather than market-friendly addresses the fact that we are trying to fix the market to address these externalities from carbon pollution, that we're still using the market, but we're trying to make it better. We're trying to fix those problems to make sure that it holds polluters accountable. Additionally, you really want to try to talk about the transformative power of the increasing carbon fee. That a lot of what makes a carbon tax unique is that price signal is what's going to really create the ripple effects throughout the economy and the different industries to get people to change their behavior. And talking about this as a transformation that we're going to be, switching over the entire economy, that resonates a lot better with liberal progressives. Again, back to that idea of fairness, pollution should not be free. I like that this one kind of applies to both sides of the aisle. Nobody wants to have their pollution dumped in public spaces or on your neighbor's lawn, like Jim was saying. And I think everybody can understand, this idea that like tobacco, you want to tax something that you don't like. And that's the fair way to do it, is to put a fee on it. And then additionally, to talk about that the lowest income people who suffer the most from climate change have the most to gain from a very fast transformative carbon pricing policy. That for the people who this is affecting right now, they don't have time to wait. And that just remembering that our policy is progressive. The dividend is what makes it progressive.
And the essential nature of also just continuing to engage them and realizing that all voices on that perspective are important to help create the pressure for that price ramp to continue going up.
Yep, it's really important to sort of gauge your conversation. You know, when you're reaching out to somebody you know really well and you can start talking about the policy right off the bat, that's fine. Sometimes with organizations, you really want to talk about, well, what are we mutually, you know, what are our mutual shared goals first? But when you are having that policy conversation, it's the household impact study is great for showing how progressive the dividend is, and showing how those lower income quintiles actually come out better off and ahead, and that the higher quintiles actually do a little bit worse. That tends to, that's more of the policy that progressives align and sort of identify as seeing as beneficial, that the low income should benefit. So one of the other really important things to use is trusted liberal allies. So a lot of CCL's spokespeople that we talk about a lot are Catherine Hayhoe and Bob Inglis, and those are great, but they are geared for a more conservative audience. And so it's important to remember that a lot of times when you're talking to progressives and liberals, that's not going to resonate with them. We have some pictures of some really great liberal and progressive minded people who have supported carbon pricing and continue to support it. And it's important to remember to use these people when you're speaking with someone who identifies as liberal progressive rather than those conservative spokespeople. Sometimes it helps to convince people as far as working on bipartisanship that there's Republicans that support this too. But it is important to remember that Barack Obama, Bernie Sanders, the Pope, who we just talked about, can kind of go both ways. Bill McKibben from 350, Secretary Stephen Chu, and Robert Reich all have supported carbon pricing. And we have some really great quotes that I'm going to read from some of these people. So Bernie Sanders, who has submitted a carbon tax in almost every Congress, says, "I'm proud that we introduced the first piece of climate legislation which called for a tax on carbon." Barack Obama has said that if there's one thing I would like to see, it'd be for us to be able to price the cost of carbon emissions. Pope Francis has said only when the economic and social costs of using up shared environmental resources are recognized with transparency and fully borne by those who incur them can those actions be considered ethical. And then lastly, Bill McKibben, 350 has been a long partner with CCL. A lot of our volunteers overlap. I'm sure some of you volunteer with them. And he has said that, "I love working with Citizens Climate Lobby. Their relentless focus on the need for a fee and dividend solution is helping drive the debate in precisely the right direction. I'm enormously grateful for their persistence and creativity." And so these are really great to use when you're reaching out and talking to people who identify as progressive, because like we've talked about, the messenger really matters. And then when you're speaking with members of Congress or, again, other organizations, some examples of Democratic supported bills. Most of these are some sort of carbon fee, cap dividend, cap and trade, carbon tax. So these are all examples of some of the ones that have been submitted. And I believe McNerney, it's on here somewhere, that one is almost identical to our policy. So there's a lot of examples of Democrats submitting this type of legislation. If you're curious sort of on what language would look like, these are also great places to look. And then for final thought, this goes back to Jonathan Haidt. One of the other things that he mentions in some of his talks that I wasn't on that list is that liberals and progressive tend to be change-seeking and seek out new experiences versus conservatives who are more into traditional and keeping things the same. And so that's important when you have these conversations and you talk about carbon fee and dividend, reminding people that this is going to be that big, complete economy-wide change that we need, rather than talking about, well, we're just going to change this and everything else is going to stay the same. That doesn't appeal to the liberal progressive audience. They want that full transition, and to remember to talk about how the progressive power of that signal and the dividend, and that will, while it goes to energy specifically, it's also going to affect a lot of those peripheral industries that progressives and liberals care about, such as agriculture or electric vehicles. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Stephanie. Let's just go to the final section. What we're going to do first is show you how to get to the actual resources on both progressive and conservative sides of things. If you go to the community homepage and then click on Take Action in the upper profile banner there, you can then go and direct in the Action Center to down to the very bottom. I just covered it up here, but there's a little button if you hover over it that says Community Outreach. And just from there, you should be able to immediately go and see the community outreach selections, including both the progressive and the conservative advice that we're distilling tonight. And then the other thing I wanted to highlight is if you're also interested in joining the action teams for either the Conservative Caucus or the Progressive Outreach team, I'll put these links in the chat window. Here's where to find them. If you go to the action teams, first off, you just go to the Connect button, and from there you can go directly to the politics section at the bottom and then click on either of those to join. So what we're going to do here for the final part of tonight's webinar is actually jump into a progressive and conservative exercise. So I'll pass it to you, Stephanie.
Cool. So for the progressive exercise, if you're running into these conversations where you're not sure how to talk about some of these common stumbling blocks, they're on the left, and these are ones that I've heard and that other CCLers have heard. This is a good chance to practice what to say back. So basically in this one, the first person is going to choose one of those common stumbling blocks or issues that get brought up on the left, and you're going to formulate the objection in your own words to your partner. And the second person is going to listen carefully to the partner's objection, and you're going to share with them in your own words what you heard. So you'll say, well, it sounds like you don't trust markets as a fair way to solve the climate problem, for example. And then the first person is going to accept, correct, clarify, or elaborate the second person's statement of the objection. And after you both agree that you heard and understand the first person's objection, you're going to formulate a response that not only validates, but acknowledges the first person's challenge with carbon fee and dividend. And then you'll continue to ask permission to share some of the reasoning that you have for supporting CCL and carbon fee and dividend and seeking common ground based on that value.
Great. So this is an actual member of Congress being interviewed on PBS NewsHour, but I will say it mirrors a lot of conversations I've had with conservatives. So you could view this as the example here is going to be viewed as a member of Congress, but it could be your next door neighbor that you're talking with over the fence. And I'd want to cue it up with one other piece. So Congressman Higgins is going to say some things that might annoy you while you're listening to him. And a part of this exercise is listening to Congressman Higgins be very willing to put a lot of his ideas on the table, which is a gift. When somebody that you disagree with is willing to say why they disagree with you or put their concerns on the table, I think you need to view it as a gift and then find a way to speak back to them from their own concerns. So the real goal here is to listen to Clay Higgins. We're going to pretend that we're in a meeting with a member of Congress. Somebody could just explain CF&D to him and close with, Clay, I understand your policy. I explained our policy, and I'd like to hear what you think about this subject. We're going to listen to this clip, and as soon as you go into your meeting rooms, what I'd like you to do is just respond back to what you think you would say in a way that speaks respectfully to Congressman Higgins, while valuing, one, the fact that he was willing to put a lot on the table, but two, he gives a lot of cues in here on ways you could reply back to him from his values, even if he's not agreeing with you on the topic material.
Sorry to cut you off, Jim. Would you recommend that if people are interested in the conservative one to even take notes so they can hear, specific phrases that they like to identify as the video progresses?
Absolutely, which I like in a meeting with a member of Congress. There is nothing wrong with sitting with a piece of paper and a pen in front of you in a meeting with a member of Congress and jotting down key phrases you hear the person say.
I certainly do not disagree with the fact that climate change happens, but I do think that it's reasonable to question very carefully the science that has used models which have sometimes come under fire for having been sort of fraudulently manipulated in order to produce a result. When we talk about spending the people's treasure and the very concept of that we can fix climate change with some sort of a tax is something that I certainly take, very seriously with regards to having intelligent debate about. In other words, I will not follow blindly into any endeavor that mandates the harvesting of the people's treasure. Climate change has existed well before human history. So the question is not whether or not our climate changes across the planet, nor is it really a question that the human race does have some sort of impact upon climate change. The question becomes to what degree and at what extent and what sort of time frame and how can we really best address that, and does it call for harvesting of the people's treasure?
Excellent. So with that, let's go to the breakout rooms, and then we're going to jump right in.
On that thought, I'd just suggest, especially when you're speaking to a member of Congress, these people speak to a lot of people. Louisiana has coastal territory. It's probably not an issue that he just hasn't looked into at all. For some interior people, they'd probably have not looked into climate change much, but people in coastal districts, they've at least had to evaluate it, which is why I think he was very cautious in the way he phrased that. Some of his statements there. He didn't just come out and say it wasn't happening. Where I think there was a lot of room in what he said to agree with him that it's really important to be appropriately skeptical of models for certain, and say that you still think there's enough evidence, you're convinced of it, and you'd like to be able to bring them back more information. It's a great reason for a follow-up meeting, an in-district meeting, an opportunity to introduce him to some people when he's back in district, if this is a meeting that's going on in DC. I think going at it from a risk perspective is a great idea. I think there's other ways you can go at it to say, hey, I view that there's a really solid consensus around this in the scientific community. And I think it's something we need to be managing that risk. I think that's a great conversation to have. And James Baker, I think it was Baker on the Climate Leadership Council, Art Laffer. If you look up either of them, you can get really good examples of how they phrase it in YouTube videos. Laffer is all about managing risks.
Thank you for stepping in tonight. And on behalf of everyone that is still on the line, if there's any questions that you have or comments about tonight's webinar, please feel free to reach out to Jim and Stephanie and myself. We'd love your feedback. We'd love to go further. If this didn't address what you were looking for, let us know how we can be a resource. And thanks again for being on the line tonight, everyone. You guys are making the critical difference out there.